Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for attending our first speaker series of 2025. My name is Wyatt Limtepper. I'm the founder and president of the nonprofit organization ATI, and I'm super excited to have Chris from the Center for Justice and Human Dignity on to talk about alternative to incarceration programs. Really excited to have met Chris. I look back, it was October of 2023, where we were in Washington, D.C. for this incredible summit, the Rewriting the Sentence 2 summit that brought in professionals, judges, everyone from the Sentencing Commission, and really just showed an immense passion for treatment court programs and really helping people. And so I'm so excited to have Chris share his story, the work that he's doing. And we're going to have a conversation about alternatives to incarceration programs and the impact they can have on the justice system. So I want to encourage the audience to feel free to submit any questions in the chat. I'm happy to monitor it and weave it into our conversation. But Chris, first and foremost, thanks so much for being here. Do you want to introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about your story? That'd be a great start.
Thank you, Wyatt. Happy to be here with you. And my name is Christopher Poulos. I'm an attorney and I'm the executive director of the Center for Justice and Human Dignity. Our focus is safely expanding alternatives to incarceration while improving conditions for both people who are incarcerated and correctional staff as well. We also do some work around reentry and reintegration at the state and federal levels. And my background, I come from state government leadership. Most recently, I was director of person-centered services, which was a new position at the Washington State Department of Corrections. And prior to that, served as the executive director of the Washington State Governor's Statewide Reentry Council for several years. Once upon a time, I was actually in the federal system as a incarcerated individual. I guess that's the term these days. So have lived experience. I am born and raised in Portland, Maine, and was in and out of both the youth and adult systems for several years from my early to mid-teens through my mid-20s. And it was actually my own lived experience through the system that gave me the determination to someday become an attorney and work to improve the system for other folks.
It's amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that, Chris. I mean, that lived experience and the powerful impact that you're having in the work you're doing across the country is, quite frankly, amazing. And we've kind of gotten to know each other a little bit over the past year and a half or so, and really just, I think, have bounced ideas about how to look at collaborative court programs, alternatives to incarceration, and kind of the complexities of what it takes to develop these programs, to implement these programs, to evaluate these programs. Maybe you could start with talking about the development of CJHD and kind of how you envision your organization having an impact at the federal level.
Sure. So CJHD was the originally created by the Aleph Institute, a group of rabbis that have been very active in the federal prison system and federal court system for several decades now. And some of the rabbis, one in particular, had a vision for being more involved in systemic work and providing assistance to courts and to prison officials and others to improve the system systemically, in addition to their work on individual cases and individual advocacy related matters. And that's how the Center for Justice and Human Dignity was originally born. We are our own 501c3 now with a board of directors that includes, for example, our board president is retired Judge Jeremy Fogel, who used to be the director of the Federal Judicial Center. And we have several both federal and other former government officials on the board of directors, as well as some other folks too. And we also have a judicial steering committee, which helps inform our work. So I think we'll probably talk about the role of non-governmental organizations with the federal courts and the challenges and opportunities there. But
Yeah.
something that has been really helpful for us has been having a board of directors and a judicial steering committee that has familiar faces when it comes to being able to do outreach and make connections with different judges and prosecutors, pretrial probation, stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a special hello and thank you to Judge Fogel, who's been just incredible in the Northern District of California, where I'm located. He helped me kind of brainstorm for my graduate thesis and is just doing incredible work over at the Berkeley Judicial Institute and just uh, brilliant and powerful in all the work that he's doing. Um, my organization, right, sits at the table with the Northern District of California, helping oversee our collaborative court programs. And I always kind of am in shock and kind of surreal that I get to sit there and have such a collaborative relationship with all these stakeholders and agencies in these complex treatment courts. For a very brief background, right, collaborative courts are interdisciplinary, interagency programs that are designed to kind of have an alternative path to outcomes in the criminal justice system. Most of them are substance use treatment courts where we're trying to get people intensive supervision and therapy and connection, quite frankly, to improve their outcomes in the system. So on the front end, this is a way to hopefully avoid a sentence of incarceration, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There are also reentry court programs that are done on the back end post-release and throughout the country, right? They're kind of splintering off into all these amazing programs that have similar structures but are working with different populations. So it's not uncommon at the state level to see a family court, a DUI court, a probation revocation court, a young adult court, behavioral health court, all these kind of amazing programs that are very well researched, have immense staffing and commitment from different stakeholders to try to find a different, way to approach the criminal justice system. And so, Chris, I think a lot of things that we've talked about before are, like you said, this kind of nonprofit, non-government entity that are working with the federal courts. And so maybe you can talk about just, some of your successes and kind of what you're looking to implement at the court system.
Sure. So, following on the heels of the Rewriting the Sentence Summit, where we initially met in DC, which was actually, let's see, fall of 2023, not the fall we just had, but the fall before that, we sent out emails. We sent out a lot of emails, both to participants and people we just thought would be interested from federal courts and other, key stakeholders, and ended up with several different districts that had varying degrees of interest and readiness to work with us as an external partner to help design, develop, stand up, and launch, and then hopefully ultimately evaluate federal problem-solving courts or alternative to incarceration programs. It started really with a focus on front-end problem-solving courts and with a desire for diversion to be the outcome. Since then, we've also gotten into a focus on reentry focused problem-solving courts or programs where people exiting, specifically people exiting Federal Bureau of Prisons and reentering communities, perhaps they're high risk, high needs. How do we set folks up that are in that group for success and hopefully avoid two things, both further harm to the community members themselves or a return to the OP. So instead, providing really a structured support and warm, reentry wraparound type services rather than letting the folks fall and then end up, going back to prison. So those are really the two things, as you mentioned, was keep people out of prison when it's safe and effective to do so, but then also try to embrace people coming home and provide the necessary supports for people to actually succeed and thrive in their communities.
Right. Absolutely. And that's where, the reentry courts, I think, are a bit more established than the front end or alternative to incarceration courts. The idea of state parole or federal probation, where people have served pretty lengthy sentences and now are reintegrating into communities that look vastly different from when they entered incarceration. And so, a common example, if someone was in pre-smartphone and then they're being released into the community, there's a whole layer just about how to do things. And so, in the work in our reentry court, I remember when I first started, gosh, it's been almost 10 years now since I've been working with the Northern District of California. We were having clients who were released from custody and were applying to jobs with paper resumes, going store to store, or using Bluetooth, in kind of their everyday life, hanging on their ears because that's what the style and everything was. And so it was really our role as a collaborative court team to learn and understand and meet clients where they were and kind of help support them and help integrate them into the community. And so it's a long process, right? It's certainly not a simple process. But we think that by having this kind of human interaction, this human approach where people are not just case numbers kind of cycling through and just do a brief check-in with their officer, and actually are able to receive services, find some support within the court system, we get much better outcomes when people experience support that they often haven't had before. And so it's these programs are incredibly complex, right? They're working in an adversarial system where in the morning, a prosecutor and defense attorney may be in trial against each other, and then in the afternoon, they may be working collaboratively in these alternative to incarceration programs to try to help treat and support clients. And so maybe we can pivot and start to talk a little bit about alternative to incarceration programs. So for clarity, post-conviction or reentry courts are when people who are being released from custody are going through programs and receiving support from the court. But let's kind of clarify a little bit about what ATI or alternative to incarceration programs are, just so we can kind of spend our focus there.
Sure. So we've covered, as you just mentioned, kind of what reentry courts or programs are. The eight front-end problem-solving courts or alternative to incarceration courts, whatever you want to call them, really have there's two primary models. One is where somebody is a participant and they're provided additional support by the court or by community partners, and a judge may take that into consideration during sentencing. However, there's no formal agreement, and we've seen that quite a bit. And you'll get all over the charts as far as, and this is why evaluation is important, and having measures and also just admission criteria and some degree of standardization as far as how the programs go, or at least how an individual program goes among the judges and pretrial folks and U.S. Attorney's Office. But some programs will say, well, no, that doesn't matter for sentencing, but we just want to make sure they're successful on pretrial. And then another judge in the same district will say, oh, I always take it into account in sentencing if they participate in one of our pretrial support programs. And then another one will say, oh, they never go to prison if they do one of them pretrial. So I found that all within the same district. So there are some models where it's not spelled out clearly what, if any, benefit will be for the participant for successfully participating in a pretrial program. However, even if there isn't a direct sentencing benefit, it's still beneficial for them to have additional supports in many cases. And I think inherently many judges and prosecutors and pretrial will take into account someone's participation in a pretrial support program. The more formalized version is a true front-end diversion program where there's an agreement between the prosecutor's office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the court and the participant and pretrial and probation, that if the person successfully completes this front-end problem-solving court, then one of two things will happen. They'll either get a non-carceral sentence, in other words, they won't be sent to BOP, they'll be going right to U.S. probation in lieu of BOP, or even that their charges will be dismissed entirely. So that is there is a range even on the front end. There's support, but no guarantee of any consideration in sentencing. There's support and likely outcome is you don't go to BOP, but the federal felony conviction is going to stand. And then finally, the kind of the most, I guess you could say, progressive outcome is that if you participate in this program successfully, your charges will be dismissed. And each of these have varying levels of eligibility and requirements that go along with them.
Right. And so extremely new, innovative to just have the possibility of having a federal charge dismissed. Avoiding incarceration is also a relatively new concept. I'd say over the past 10 or so years, it's really gained a lot of momentum for different districts around the country. But these can sometimes be these post-plea pre-adjudication programs that are quite frankly very intensive for their supervision. For example, our conviction alternatives program here in the Northern District of California uh, requires participants to show up to court every 2 weeks. Weekly, they're going to a CBT group. They're oftentimes going to individual counseling. They're encouraged to go to NA and AA meetings. And they also hopefully will be able to find a job, go to school, find pro-social engagements. It's a very, very intensive programming, but the hope is that we can have these kind of public health interventions or this design where we're showing this support or this different way of living in the community. And there's a huge incentive, right, to avoid prison. But along the way, we want to build trust with them where they can kind of see this positive momentum. And it's not uncommon for our participants to say, a federal indictment was actually the best thing that ever happened to me because now I actually have the support and resources through things like a supportive probation officer, therapy, to actually make changes in my life, address my sobriety, and really grow within my community. So, they're very, very complex. We haven't even touched on eligibility factors. So things like PITRA scores, previous criminal background, substance use needs, mental health needs. These are all factors that go into the admission process, and they really vary, I think, district by district, venue by venue. And a big challenge is trying to get consistency across these programs because there's a huge program design and years, literally years of people coming together and stakeholders coming to an agreement before these programs are actually implemented. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or you wanted to talk a little bit about the work you've done with specific districts that may lend well to ATI programs.
Sure. So the district that we're working with most closely and we're kind of most far along with is where I'm located. I live in Olympia, Washington, so it's a natural fit for us to work with the Western District of Washington. And it was, perhaps we could say, divine timing that as we launched this program, the Western District of Washington, which already had a ATI program called DREAM, that for at least several years, perhaps even many years at this point, wanted to start or was in the process of starting, and to give them credit that it was well on its way to being developed for quite a while before I and CJHD got involved in any way. But they slash we are currently working on finishing up the design, and very soon it's actually, I think, technically launched because we're in the process of selecting the first participants now. A federal mental health focused diversion court, meaning that in this situation, for successful applicants that participate in the program successfully, the anticipated outcome after a period of somewhere between 12, 18, 24 months, depending on the participants' needs and other factors, the anticipated outcome would be the dismissal of the federal charges. And so how that is, there are other federal mental health support related courts. To our knowledge, this is the first one that's on the front end and is a actual agreed upon, not a maybe the judge will think about it, maybe the prosecutor will think about it. It's in writing that if you participate successfully, and it's I believe the intent is to set people up for success. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this. The outcome is anticipated, which a dismissal of federal charges. And of course, there is eligibility requirements. The U.S. Attorney's Office needs to be on board, and they have certain restrictions as far as what can be included, what can't be included. And there is some, wiggle room within that. There's other offenses and criminal histories where there's really not, at least from the U.S. Attorney's perspective. But the need for this was originally historically was the U.S. Attorney's Office and judges saw folks who were coming before them facing federal felony criminal charges who clearly had a substantial mental health condition. And there was a clear nexus between the conduct in question, the conduct that led to the federal charges, and the mental health condition. So that would be the type of situation where we'd be looking, and everyone agreed sending this individual to BOP is not a it's not a good remedy for anybody. It's not good for the community. It's not good for their family. It's not good for the individual. We don't think it'll be effective. But at the same time, this conduct is too serious for us as the federal government to ignore. So what do we do? That's how this started before I got involved. And so it was over the course of years with lots of different stakeholders, and now the Center for Justice and Human Dignity being involved, was this, okay, let's find folks who meet this kind of pretty narrow criteria of substantial mental health condition, serious enough to not just ignore the conduct from a federal government perspective, but also BOP is not going to help them or enhance public safety. So that's how this started. An example that I thought of for this, and I can't speak for the judges or prosecutors, but let's say somebody's at Mount Rainier National Park, right? And they're in a mental health crisis, and they think that the ranger is after them, and they end up in a tussling around with the ranger, right? They could be facing a federal, battery on a federal law enforcement officer, but it was clearly related to a untreated mental health condition. Like, it is 5 years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons going to effectively address the conduct in question? Maybe not. Maybe this person does need support, treatment. Maybe they need medication. So that's my example. Again, not speaking for any of the judges or prosecutors, but that's the kind of thing. Because you're like, what? Well, when could this happen?
Right.
Some of the folks have offered even bolder examples. I'm not gonna right now, but I think the national park example is one that would fit that criteria.
Yeah, and that's a great example, right? I think what we've learned from these collaborative courts is that there's an idea of being mindful about interventions for all populations that are involved in the criminal justice system. Most ways we see that with substance use, and someone is a substance user who has a horrible addiction for many, many years. Every time they use, they commit crimes, whether small or big. They get caught and they're involved in the justice system, kind of recidivating. uh, Something to be mindful of is that most people who are incarcerated are released at some point, and we need to kind of be thoughtful about how to be accountable to our communities, protect public safety. But what is going to be the intervention for when people are released? And if prison does more harm and they're dealing with an additional layer of institutionalization, how do these treatment court teams really develop appropriate interventions? And that's where I like to think my organization and these treatment courts in general really play an important role. And it's kind of thinking about it not just through a criminal justice lens, but through a public health lens as well. And so bringing in substance use therapists to be part of that collaborative court team to make sure that individual therapists with special or trauma certifications and training and understanding dual diagnosis, it's important to have them at the table to understand these things. Some things that are amazing in our district is that we've had a few LCSWs who are also pretrial officers. So they bring in kind of a social work approach and a huge social work internship program in our district where we get access to academia and kind of learn about the best practices in social work that are happening in addition to case management for clients going through our program. So substance use and kind of criminal thinking areas, I think, have been kind of the more accepted treatment courts, right? Mental health courts and kind of the severe mentally ill medication monitoring, it gets very, very complex because there's some diagnoses that are very difficult to treat or see any progress. And it really takes, I think, a dedicated court team to be open and willing to address that need of a client. And so I don't know how much you can share about the development of, the mental health court, but really being attentive to, what went into the actual design and how you got people to the table to really problem solve through what a program could look like. I'd be so curious to just, hear about that development.
Well, I'll start by saying I wasn't part of the initial development, but I know that the basic idea is that if we're not going to send Joe to federal prison, what are we going to do instead, right? That is like at the most fundamental level. So that means we've been working to identify safe and stable housing resources, working to identify transportation resources, make sure that Joe has a bus pass, and make sure that there's food available from one way or another. Make sure that there's access to treatment, access to peer support, peer coaching, stuff like that. So that is and that getting all of those things lined up, which is still a work in progress, but working on getting all those things lined up has been essential for getting, buy-in and support from all of the key stakeholders, including pretrial, probation, U.S. Attorney's Office, and the magistrate and district court judges. The defense counsel is not hard to convince that we should be doing alternatives to incarceration, but everybody agrees that, if we're not going to send Joe to federal prison, we need to collectively set Joe up for success in the community. And yes, there's still going to be accountability. There's still going to be requirements, but we want to make sure that, people are set up for success. And there's even some cases where if somebody is not able to, make it to, say, a biweekly court session, or join virtually once a week, whatever, we're still working out the exact precise details as far as what the requirements are. But we don't want to admit somebody if it's really going to end up that they end up not being able to succeed. So part of it is not just sweeping people through to not have any effort or any challenges or any gain, but if it's not realistic for any number of reasons for a person to be successful, then that may not be the best participant, and it may be that, the normal process, the track, is unfortunately what it's going to be. But those are some of the key components, is looking at even the same things you'd look at for someone's successful reentry is what we'd look at for someone's successful diversion.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up just phenomenal points about just general program design. And it really is kind of this health approach where we want to do no harm. And we can't ask, participants to join our program and expect them to get a 4-year degree in the 1 year that they're working with us. And yeah, I think it's taken a lot of experience and understanding assessments and different things that are happening, where understanding what we know about a client from bail reports, interviews, mental health assessments, are all helpful, but actually working so closely with participants over the course of 12 to 18 months can really help navigate and bring up new issues and new challenges with people that don't come up until later on. And so, we like to make sure that we understand the complexities of people's challenges and what can be triggering. And it can be something small like getting someone a mental health therapist versus a substance use counselor when they've expressed an interest, or express a history of substance use disorder, but they haven't addressed any mental health issues. And so, this kind of just touches the tip of the iceberg as far as the complexity of these programs, where we only have so much information in front of us. Sometimes assessments are old or are different since they've been incarcerated and may have different risk levels. There's all these different kind of very humanistic factors where we as programs want to make sure that we're addressing needs that we're capable of. And so having the right partnerships with probation and pretrial and their contracted vendors, finding different community organizations that are actually doing the direct services and work to make sure that we have the referrals is all integral part to the role of these treatment courts and making sure that people actually have good outcomes while in our programs. Um, while I think these programs are immensely successful, right, they're not a magic wand. I think we both know that, just because someone's working in these treatment courts doesn't guarantee that their life turns around. And I think the research shows that people that are high risk, high need, right, we get the most benefit, and those are the best to admit to these programs. But with the population, there are going to be failures. And people will recidivate, people will violate, and we need to programmatically, right, do our best to have the right interventions, but there are challenges to that. And so I was hoping that we could move into evaluation a little bit because, as an example, sometimes it's not as simple as successfully completed or unsuccessfully completed. It's not just they graduated and everything's fine. Sometimes someone can do very, very well, but if they're in a drug court and they relapse in the later phase of their program, they time out according to their plea agreement and may not be able to successfully complete, even though they've made massive improvement. Um, there's also things like committing new crimes, but relapsing as a violation may not be maybe a big step down from the previous crimes that they committed, and sometimes people can view those as success. So let's talk broadly just about evaluation and how you think we should be approaching evaluation for ATI programs.
Great topic, great question, and also a challenging topic, especially for federal problem-solving courts, for a number of reasons. One of the challenges with a certain methods of research is that to have statistically significant research results, you really need hundreds of participants, and then you need a matching group or a randomized control trial type group in order to do what would be considered. And I'm not a researcher, so but I've learned a lot about what researchers do over the last year, and it's simply not feasible for some of the research methods that are desired by both certain foundations as well as from government funding entities to be able to do that when you may have 5 to 10 participants over the course of a given year. It's just I guess they say the N number is not significant enough to measure. And so you can't really effectively determine whether there was a causal relationship between the program participation and the individual's success versus the success of others if there's only 5 participants in a program. There have been some studies that have done aggregate research on federal problem solving courts. So if anyone's interested in those today, check out, do a Google search or email me and I can send them to you directly. But Kevin Wolf, Chris Dozier, Laura Baber, federal sentencing reporter. There's been a series of research studies done, and the outcomes have not really shown very clear and convincingly that these ATIs are better, at least on a purely statistical level and the way that they've been studied to date. However, we know anecdotally that we have these and we'll talk, I hope we can share a couple stories of people that have participated and the amazing impact in individuals' lives that, but for this program, they would have been warehoused in prison for years, would have lost custody of their children, would have lost their home, right? All of these things that are not really conducive to healthy families, healthy communities, healthy individuals. So I'll start by that disclaimer by saying it's very difficult to do certain studies. However, there are other studies and other measures that can be implemented to determine success. I think first is having clear criteria of what the admission process entails. How are we selecting people, who is eligible? It can't, sometimes it's the judge thinks, Joe's got a chance, so I'm gonna put Joe in. Emily, she's been here 3 times. She doesn't look at me and smile at me. Emily's going down. So there is some arbitrary human factor decision making. And I think that is going to exist to an extent, but the more that there can be, an evaluation, an assessment of the person's needs and match for a program, the more, the better, I guess, or fiducia, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but the better results are going to be as far as being able to determine the effectiveness. One of the things Wyatt and I have talked about, and I've talked about with Dr. Kevin Wolf from John Jay too, is doing, kind of an assessment along the way while the person is still participating, not simply looking in 5 years, did Joe go back to prison or not, which is the classic measure of success. Instead, as Joe starts the ATI program, did Joe seek employment during the first 3 weeks? Did Joe attain employment during the first 2 months? Did Joe stabilize in their, mental health treatment and make it to their appointments? So those are the kinds of micro measurements that can happen along the way that can determine the effectiveness of the program. There also can be matching studies where if there is a district that does have, say, 500, criminal felony defendants per year, and there's 10 that participate or 20 that participate in an ATI program, and then another 20 with matching characteristics, that's another way that things can be evaluated. But yeah, there are certainly challenges to doing a purely scientific causal study when a court has 10 participants or less.
Right, right. And that's, I think, just one of the challenges that we have at the federal level. I mean, a lot of the state level collaborative courts are seeing 50 people per week and going through different programs versus the federal level, we may get 50 people per year. And it's just a little bit of a numbers game where it's going to take a very long time to get consistency. And like you said, that N number to actually get enough for evaluation. I do just want to kind of plug very quickly this concept of not just recidivism. Recidivism and sober days are generally measurements in the criminal justice system that have been kind of the focal point, which are very important data measurements, right? It's important to know these things, and when they occur while in supervision or involved in the court system. They're also negative snapshots, and there's other opportunities to actually show kind of the progress someone's making in the community. And so recently, All Rise released as their amended best practices to implement this thing called recovery capital assessments. And that measures different buckets of social, physical, emotional, social capital where people are making these small improvements. And so I'd love to just share a quick story. And Chris, I'm sure you have one or many to share as well, but one of our clients, one of my favorite memories is that, before they came into the drug court, it was just him and his partner with a baby expecting, and they ended up meeting with me weekly just to kind of check in. And having that kind of consistency in their life was something that was absent and kind of led them to their success in their program. They were mid 20s, young 20s when they started, and that was a good 6 or 7 years ago. They now have 3 kids, both have driver's license, working full-time jobs. And they're able to do that because he avoided incarceration. By successfully completing the program, addressing his sobriety, and really working on their relationship, we have these beautiful stories of family commitment that lead to very happy, productive, successful lives. And so, Chris, I don't know if there's any client anecdotes that you wanted to share, but those are those feel-good moments that are the good reminders of why we do this work.
That's great. And I have two stories that come to mind. One was shared during the Rewriting the Sentence Summit with 'cause we had something like 60 formerly incarcerated people from all over the country, or system impacted people, including people that didn't get incarcerated because of these programs, participate in the summit. And then another one was during a recent visit I did to Utah's federal problem solving courts. So the first one was a situation where there was a guy who was maybe in his 30s or 40s at the time and had never been arrested for anything. No criminal record, no trouble with the law. And suddenly he's getting caught stealing uh, farm equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and driving it from, he's a farmer, and he's driving it from the neighbors' farms back over to his farm, and then he's going to other places and getting into these really expensive tractors and driving them to his farm or around the street, and everyone is, he gets caught very quickly, and he's, facing huge federal, I mean, excuse me, I think this was state, but it was felony theft, right? At a big scale, and looking at pretty substantial prison time and huge fines and restitution and all this stuff. And somebody, in the prosecutor's office or his attorney or some group thereof was like, this doesn't make sense. And the defendant didn't have a great explanation for it. And somebody had the wherewithal to do a mental health assessment. And it turned out that the person who, with no criminal record, who was suddenly became the farm equipment bandit, right? Had a substantial untreated mental illness. And thankfully, they were able to get the person stabilized in a state pretrial program. And I believe that they were able to at least do a non-custodial sentence and possibly even got the charges dismissed. So that, I think, I don't know if that was a formal, I think it may either it was part of a formal diversion program, or that was the impetus to create in that area, because they were like, what, wait, why is this person, why are we going to send them to prison? They don't even realize why they're taking this farm equipment. And I think I mean, I don't want to go into what the diagnosis was, but it was a diagnosis where someone thought they needed this farm equipment, right? And they needed it at 2 in the morning, and they needed it to bring it from Joe's farm to their farm, and just wasn't adding up as someone who was doing it for, and knowingly, intentionally, willingly, all of those factors that we like to believe are part of the, system. So that was one of them. One that was another situation was in Utah, where it was a woman who had already been in trouble a couple times and was not eligible for a full diversion. However, they were looking at, I think it was a minimum of 60 months in prison, and had been kind of in and out of the system for a long time, but really wanted to change their life. The woman wanted to change their life, had some young children, had a brother that was in recovery, and the day we visited Utah's problem solving courts, which Utah has like very advanced federal problem solving courts. This actually, Wyatt and I have been with the Federal Judicial Center and Western District of Washington and some other districts as well to visit one of Utah's courts. But this was I don't think this was that one. I think this was my first time there, but correct me if you remember this story. You can say, yeah, I was there too. I don't think it was the same one though. And it was the graduation for a woman, again, that was facing 60 months, so 5 years in federal prison. And she successfully completed the program that she was part of. And again, that because of the criminal record, she wasn't able to get a dismissal, but she was able to get a non-custodial sentence. So 5 years of her life where she would have been separated from her young children and from her family, she, got better during the participation in the program. I don't know whether that means 100% abstinence or whether it means she's on a healthier track than she was before. Whatever got better and doing better meant for her. Got employment, I think, got into school, was able to redirect her life with the support of community, providers, and even with support of pretrial probation and the court itself, encouraging judges and other folks. And long story short, seeing the charges be, the sentence be essentially commuted by the judge and given a 2-year supervision or something like that in lieu of 60 months of probation and likely a 3-year supervision would be my guess. And to have her and see her in the courtroom with her young children embracing and hearing her brother say, "You better stay on this track now," because the brother was in sobriety as well. And that was incredibly powerful, and that's worth doing, is what I would say. Even if we don't yet, I hope we do have clear and convincing causal, evidence that these programs are without a doubt incredibly effective. There's situations like that and stories like that where it's worth doing, and it really can have a major positive benefit on people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing both those stories and just the actual impact it has on people's lives. If you haven't attended one of these treatment court graduations, they're often open, most of the time, open to the public and really just the most powerful, I think, human interaction and the outcomes that I think everyone wants in the justice system, where judges can be frustrated with sentencing, defense attorneys and prosecutors aren't satisfied with how a case ends up. These are pretty magical human moments. And we haven't even talked about the cost of saving someone from incarceration. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to wrap up with a couple questions and this kind of navigates with the question asked in the chat. But let's talk a little bit about where you see ATI programs going in the next 5 years or so, and just kind of tied to the question, if you can, how do you anticipate the current administration will affect public and private support for these types of ATI programs?
So I think, starting with the specific question itself, we don't know yet. I think that's, interestingly to say that, for example, there was a restorative justice program that was in Hawaii that I believe was started under the prior, not under the Biden administration, but under the first Trump administration with support from the U.S. attorney in Hawaii. And then that ended up being discontinued under the last administration. So that's why I say we don't we really don't know where things are going to go, where support is going to go. And I think I'd only be speculating if I was to comment on that in detail right now. I'm hopeful that the U.S. attorneys that are going to be in place in the current administration see the value of diverting people when it's, safe and effective to do so, and being able to, have the not just the cost savings of not sending someone to Federal Bureau of Prisons, but the healing, the family benefits, the breaking generational cycles of poverty and trauma and incarceration. So I hope that there's an interest and willingness from the new round of U.S. attorneys that are coming in. I think on the reentry side, there should be. I think I'm more confident to say that really, regardless of political beliefs, I think it's anybody that says I don't support successful reentry. I don't know that I've ever heard someone be opposed to supporting on the reentry side. It can get tricky on the front end alternative and diversion side, but I mean, where I would love to see things go is to see the best practices known for federal alternatives to incarcerations, and then to have organizations like the Center for Justice and Human Dignity and like Wyatt's organization and like-minded and judges, prosecutors to be able to really scale these programs in districts where they exist, and support other districts with designing, launching, and evaluating their own federal alternative to incarceration and reentry support programs. And that's something I had to make sure that we mention, is that something the Center for Justice and Human Dignity is able to help districts that would like support in design, in stakeholder engagement, in evaluation, in visiting other districts with existing programs. That's something we're able to help facilitate for any folks that are interested.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for sharing that. I mean, I think what we found at the federal level is that there's a curiosity across districts. For some districts have a lot of robust programming, shifting programming. Um, it's not always the administration that leads to a program being left, right? Sometimes it's just a capacity and resource time because let's be honest, right? These programs are very time intensive for officers, judges, and attorneys. And they're typically volunteering their time because they believe in these programs and they believe in the cause. And so, volunteer time plus scaling is a pretty difficult equation to kind of deal with. And so, just to kind of piggyback on all the growth that you mentioned, right? It's my hope that we can really work with stakeholders together to just have an idea to help each population and have a hope or a game plan to get an outcome that we want, that all stakeholders are going to be satisfied with, where we're actually helping people involved in the justice system. And that can be anything from a diagnosis and mental health treatment to addressing their sobriety to just having some support in the criminal justice system where as opposed to looking at a judge who is giving out a sentence, they see them as a support that believes in them. And there's a very, very big impact, I think, when a person with a big title and power uh, is in your corner and has support for you when you're working on yourself. So there's just all this immense benefit from, people really working on themselves and doing a lot of hard work emotionally, mentally, by addressing their challenges. Um, there's also great professional growth for everyone involved, right? So I think every judge, officer, and attorney thinks that they're better at their role because of their participation in these programs. And so just to kind of close things out, Chris, we started the speaker series AQI did in 2020 because we wanted to just kind of talk to experts who are working in the treatment court field or working in reentry to just tell a judge, officer, attorney, what's something that you want to take away from the work that you do? What's one takeaway that you want a judge to walk away with from understanding the complexity of these programs and all the hard work and effort and collaboration that you're doing in your work?
I think a couple of things. One is that, support is available, whether it's through, and let me see if I can actually say it correctly, ACURI.
Exactly.
Okay. I should know. I am a lawyer too. Or the Center for Justice and Human Dignity through the Federal Judicial Center, and there are supports available. So even if there's not immense funding available for a district that's interested, there are some resources available to at least assist with, program design, program launch, and hopefully research and evaluation as well. I also, as far as, next 5 years, I'd love to see congressional funding
Mhm.
specifically earmarked for this, and that's something we are looking into, seeing if it could be a possibility. There's been directives, at least in the past administration, to develop alternatives to incarceration and have a diversion program for every U.S. attorney's office and different things like that. And we'd love to see those, ideals and directives matched with congressional stable funding so that districts that were interested, or perhaps every district, could have a problem solving court coordinator, something like that to help be able to make these programs sustainable. We'd also like to see philanthropy step up and get more involved in federal problem solving courts. It's kind of like a new frontier, both for federal government stakeholders and for philanthropy. They're like, huh, you're working with the federal courts? It's just, and even, I'm getting less and less of this now that we're becoming a bit more known in the field. But at first, I'd call a, pretrial office and say, hey, I heard you all have this, dream program. That's not a great example because that's the one in Seattle, and they were very welcoming from the very beginning.
Yeah.
But, I hear you have this hope program, and they would literally not know if they were able to even tell me about their program because they were so not used to non-governmental entities taking an interest. They were like, whoa, before I can tell you, I need to talk to my where supervisor and different things like that. Whereas, state and local jurisdictions, it's very normal to be working with NGOs and community partners and stuff like that. I think on the service side, it's pretty well established for federal courts too, but not necessarily on the development side. Like, you're going to be in with our meetings when we're deciding
Great.
how we want to do this.
Yeah.
And it turns out not only is that okay, it can really be helpful through developing trust and developing partnerships. And it really works to the advantage of everyone involved.
Yeah, that's an amazing point, and really lends to just the familiarity of these programs. Where meeting with state level courts, they're kind of like, oh, I didn't know the feds were doing something like we're doing. And just kind of being able to talk through and understand the network of these programs is super important. It's funny, I actually get a similar response sometimes where I let them know that I work with federal courts, and some community providers are like, oh, hold on. Are you FBI? Are you coming to investigate us? Are you from the IRS really looking for? And so it's kind of really developing a nonprofit to nonprofit trust where we're just looking to help people in the community and we share a similar population, and really getting to know and understand, where our connections can lie to really improve outcomes in the justice system. So, Chris, any final thoughts or any ideas you wanted to share before we welcome any questions and close out?
No, I just, thank you everyone who took the time on a Friday
Mm.
to join us. And if anyone wants to talk about, about these programs further, both, I'm sure Wyatt and I are available to do so. And I'll just, it sounds cheesy, but I have to emphasize that people can and do change and heal and grow. And it's these types of programs, when developed well and when set up for success, can really help facilitate that for folks. So thank you all for joining today, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested.
Yeah, thank you everyone in the audience for being here. And Chris, thank you again for just sharing your story, all the work that you're doing for ATI programs at the federal level. And really just loved kind of working with you over the past 18 months and looking to grow a lot together. We'll be circulating the recording of this both on our YouTube channel and for everyone that registered for this program. And then to just be on the lookout for our upcoming May speaker series, we'll be talking with a social worker from the VA who works at a veterans court, and kind of learning about their interest and challenges in problem solving court. So another population that, we need to address and work through in the criminal justice system. So thank you everyone for attending. And Chris, thank you so much again for your time. Uh, Everyone have a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.